Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the La Esmeralda wash processed Costa Rica from Clarimento. And there's the box right there. And Clarimento, based out of Seoul, Korea, and this is their second ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed the Sadama Duancho, a red honey processed Ethiopian coffee. And I'd have to say that that was one of my favorite coffees that we've reviewed from any Korean-based coffee roaster. So I did want to revisit Clarimento when I got an opportunity. And when I saw this coffee, it did catch my interest for a number of reasons, but the biggest reason being the varietal mix that this one does have, as it's partially SL28 and partially Geisha, coupled with the fact that it is a wash-processed Costa Rican coffee, and this one definitely caught my interest. So I'm definitely looking forward to discussing this coffee, as this right here is day 42. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. So as I've mentioned in the past with a lot of the Korean roasters that we've reviewed up to this point, none of them are necessarily overly light, though Clarimento does skew on the lighter side of things relative to a lot of the coffee roasters that we have had from Korea. And this one I would say is on par with that, as it's kind of, I would say, on that more traditional light medium, as it's not necessarily overly light, but at the same time, I didn't necessarily feel too much development from this one. So I feel like that's kind of the best way to align this one. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 16, first impression, and we did opt for the V60. And the cup itself was very interesting right off the bat, as it was offering a very Kenyan-like experience, as the coffee is very bright and very tart in a Kenyan berry-like sense, but it's also cleaner, as the berry aspects of this one are present with a, I'd just say, notable bit of definition and clarity to them. In addition to that, there's plenty of stone fruit components, as this one is just clean and quite bright, lending itself towards a nice start. Day 19, through the Chemex, and the coffee does continue to offer a very unique feel to it, as it has plenty of the Kenyan-like brightness, and it does remain an ever-present component within this one, but it's also offering more of a geisha-like white florality with a complementary berry and stone fruit component to that as well. So it's been a pretty unique experience in regard to the fact that it is acting like a Kenyan, but a very, very clean Kenyan coffee. Day 22 through the April brewer, and the coffee has taken its first step back, as this time it's a bit more generic, with a combination of the brightness and clarity offering a bit more of a brighter berry sense with a slightly cleaner stone fruit. It's still good and interesting, but just the overall intensity this time around was toned down relative to some of the earlier experiences. Day 25 through the V60 with Clarimento's recipe, and the cup is good again, but not to the same extent as some of the earlier days, as it is offering a slight bit less of the tart berry brightness and a little bit more of the florality. And usually that's a winning recipe for me, but for whatever reason, I was really enjoying the very Kenyan-like experience of this coffee, and I would say that's mostly because it didn't come with a lot of those savory qualities to it. If anything, it came to a much more, we'll just say, better defined and cleaner brightness of those berry aspects. Stone fruits continue to present themselves in a cleaner sense as well, leaving a very lingering Kenyan-like feel to this coffee. Day 28 through the Chemex with Clarimento's recipe, and it's better today, as it's offering plenty of the notable Kenyan-like feel to it, but also a lovely bit of clarity, as there's an interesting stone fruit component that I would describe as being reminiscent of Kenyan stone fruit qualities. So this is kind of an interesting thought that I feel like a lot of people can relate to. When you are experiencing a flavor profile from a certain origin, it acts different than it does in another origin. So for example, the peachiness that you get from a Colombian coffee is notably different than the peachiness you get from an Ethiopian coffee, and while they can be similar, something along the lines of an Ethiopian and a Panamanian coffee, you can tell a fair bit of difference to them when you're experiencing them from origins that just seem to have such different characteristics. And that's the best way I can describe this coffee, is because it's presenting the peachiness as Kenyan coffees present that peachiness. They're still bright, and you still get a little bit of the tartness from the overall Kenyan attributes of it. However, it's just coming out in that bright sense, as it's offering a very unique brightness in that peachy aspect. There's a lingering sweetness to it as well, with some sweeter citric qualities and even a bit of those bright berries yet again. Day 31 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee is still interesting as it does continue to hone in on the brighter Kenyan-like qualities of this one, opening up in terms of the sweetness in the finish. Has a very nice sugariness to it, this time in a peachy sense, as the lovely Kenyan-like stone fruits continue to remain a very abundant quality within this coffee, and that would continue to expand upon from this point going forward, as on day 34 we opted for the Chemex with our standard recipe, and it continues to remain very interesting. And even with the adjustments in brew method, with the exception of the April day, it just has a very interesting, very clean representation of a washed Kenyan coffee with the notable bright aspects to it. Sweet and a bit more of the floral tones this time around, as the coffee has improved with time. Day 37 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee is certainly an interesting one, with the peachiness being a very vibrant experience within this coffee in a Kenyan-like sense. So imagine a lot of those Kenyan-like bright berries that you can experience in general, but imagine them presented in much more of that peachy aspect to them. It's quite sweet as well. So all of these characteristics are just so unique and interesting that it made for a very interesting experience overall. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a lot of level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. I do have to say that this one is probably even on the higher side of level 4, and it makes a lot of sense given the varietal mix that is presented within this one. I don't want to necessarily prime myself on this coffee, but I do have to wonder whether or not the nice combination of a Gesha, which on paper and in theory should be about as clean as you can get for a varietal, combined with an SL28, making it a little bit more clean in general, you just see a very nice combination of marriage, because I feel like on paper and in theory, when you combine two varietals like this, you should experience the best of both of their characteristics, and that was what I experienced with this coffee, most notably in the cleanliness, as this one is one of the cleaner Costa Rican coffees we've had in quite a while. So definitely a true level 4 there. If anything, given the very nice definition presented within this coffee, I could even see it being higher than that. Finish, level 4. And I really appreciated the finish on this one, because once again, it acts like a Kenyan coffee without any of these savory qualities to it, without any of those tomato-like qualities to it. So presenting it in a lingering peachy brightness is just so fun and unique and different in general. Sweetness level 4. I mentioned that this coffee is just surprisingly sweet, as it's not necessarily always the case when it comes to either SL28 or Gesha coffees, especially when they are presented in a wash processing. So having this one be so sugary sweet was very enjoyable, especially given that it did come in a bit more of a fruit sense to it as well. Acidity level 4. The brightness, I mentioned pretty early on, the brightness is just so Kenyan-like, and given that it's presenting itself in that stone fruit sense, makes it even more interesting. I am experiencing a slightly tart berry tone to it as well, which also did give this one a bit of depth, so I'm very intrigued overall by the overall brightness that was presented within this coffee. Florality, level 4. And I feel like this is where the Gesha qualities came into play, as there's definitely some white florals that are presented within this coffee. I feel like that's one of the notes that they had listed on here, something like peach and then white florals, and I can definitely see an abundance of those white florals. And early in this coffee, I was wondering why they didn't have any sort of berry note listed on here, given that those Kenyan qualities are just so abundant within this coffee. And I think by the end I said, it's because the other qualities in this coffee are just much more prominent and pronounced, even with a very obvious Kenyan-like brightness. Berry fruit, level 4, that's what I'm alluding to. Definitely experienced a fair bit of that, a little bit more of those tart berry aspects within this one. If anything, maybe you could say it's a lighter tart berry, so maybe something a little bit more of a, I think they have white currants, or if that's even a thing. But yeah, just a little bit more of a lighter colored tart berry in this experience. Citrus fruit, level 4, and I think that's once again the Gesha qualities at play, and even a little bit of the SL28 qualities, because both of them do tend to offer a little bit more of a citric component to them, and given that this coffee is just so bright, it did also present itself in a citric-like sense. Stone fruit, level 4, I've kind of been harping on that since the start. The peachiness in this one is just so unique, and I really appreciated it for so many reasons. I'm obviously a very big fan of peachy qualities that are presented within coffees, so when they're presented in just such a unique sense, it makes for such a fun experience. And then we have one level 3, final thing worth discussing actually, and that is the body. And that's, I guess, a little bit more in line with what I would expect from this coffee, though it can go either way. SL28 does tend to have a little bit more body, and Gesha do tend to have a little bit less body. So I appreciate the fact that it offered this one in a bit more of a textured sense, and Costa Rican origin could be at play right here, as it just had a little bit more of that medium-like experience to it. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It's just kind of interesting with this coffee roaster. I feel like I was very lucky with the 2 coffees we've actually reviewed from them, because that Sadama Dewancho was actually very enjoyable, and it might actually be my favorite Korean coffee that we've reviewed up to this point. And this one might be much more enjoyable than that coffee, mostly because of just how unique it was. I've never had a coffee that's presented itself like this. I mean, I've had Kenyan coffees in the past that have been a little bit more peachy, but in that regard, they've been a little bit more on the traditional peachy side of things, where this one right here, it acted like a Kenyan coffee, but even then, we still must take into account that this is a Costa Rican coffee. So this one lived up to the expectations that I had for it, because I was hoping that this coffee would be something a little different and unique, and it did turn out to be exactly what I was hoping for, and I did enjoy it. I found myself enjoying every single time I brewed this coffee. It was one of those that I looked forward to brewing. Now, it's not necessarily going to be my favorite coffee of the entire year, because I still feel like the profile is skewed a little bit away from my own preferences, in the sense that it's a slight bit more developed than I would necessarily like. But outside of that, I found so many positives within this coffee, as I found it to be a very beautiful representation of SL28, Gesha, and Costa Rican coffees put together. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to: if you really enjoy your Kenyan coffees, you really appreciate the brightness of them, and you also really like peachy qualities, then this one's an ideal fit. It presents all of those things with a very prominent sugariness, as well as prominent floral quality to it as well. All of this presented in a very clean sense as well, well above average in terms of the overall cleanliness. So I feel like that's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the La Esmeralda, wash processed Costa Rica from Clarimento. Thank you for watching.